The rules of business and society have changed, and Mishkondareya stands at the forefront of this change, championing the innovation ecosystem at the heart of Cambridge. Discover what you can do with the law of tomorrow today at mishkon.com.
Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
Well, welcome to this week's episode. Faye isn't with me this week as she's been at Founders, the University of Cambridge Demo Day in London. I'm sure we'll hear all about her experiences next week. I, on the other hand, have been completely wiped out by illness this week. So apologies if I sound a little bit different. I'm just dealing with that still. So I couldn't get out and about this week and missed the Founders event, which I'm gutted about. But looking ahead to next week and looking forward to getting back to my normal self. So this week's Cambridge Tech News in partnership with Business Weekly. IQGeo have recommended the sale of the company to Kohlberg, Kravis and Roberts Co. for around £330 million. The takeover should become effective in Q4 of this year, with KKR taking IQGeo private. Business Weekly understands that IQGeo will continue to operate under the brand from its Cambridge HQ and also expects the additional investment promised under the prospective acquisition to underpin fresh recruitment drives. Marshall in Cambridge has won a contract worth more than £100 million to design and produce an extensive suite of command and control shelters, modular workspaces and ancillary equipment for the Swedish Defence Materiel Administration. Ekion Technologies in Cambridge, which supplies niobium battery anode materials, has teamed up with Australian global contracting group MACA for a key project. Raspberry Pi have confirmed that they do intend to IPO in London as early as next month in a major boost to the UK. And superchip superstar ARM has pledged to increase its stake in the business, having invested just last year. The IPO is intended to raise £500 million, according to market watchers, and Raspberry Pi aims to raise about £40 million from the issue of new shares. ARM says it will take £35 million of those new shares itself. More sources globally have confirmed that SoftBank, the Japanese company that brought ARM and retained a major shareholding following its New York float last September, is set to acquire GraphCore for around $500 million. GraphCore's expertise could be harnessed to ARM's power in AI when SoftBank completes the deal, creating a new global powerhouse with Cambridge and Bristol bases. The Cambridge tech ecosystem has a value of $191 billion, which represents 18% of the entire UK tech ecosystem and more than Spain and Italy combined, according to new analysis by Deal Room for Founders at the University of Cambridge. Gerard Grech, who is the managing director at Founders, said Cambridge is a powerhouse of innovation thanks to its combination of groundbreaking entrepreneurs, forward-thinking scientists, research institutions, and investors. And this data proves that, but we can't rest on our laurels. So exciting news and great to see the data behind that. Now, that's the end of the news, but it's the last week to get your applications in to take part in Cambridge Tech Week's Innovation Alley, which is on Tuesday, the 10th of September. So if you're a startup, a scale-up, or a large tech company who wants to gain exposure to the Cambridge community and the broader national and international tech ecosystems, then please follow the links on our social media or head over to cambridgetechweek.co.uk/innovation-alley-2024. Okay, and on to today's episode. We are joined by CSO of Better Origin, Miha Pipan, who is going to talk to us about how AI and bugs come together to address a number of the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
So welcome, Miha.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. So the whole rationale behind Better Origin is that if it was up to nature, waste wouldn't exist. It would be absorbed by the soil or eaten by insects. So with that in mind, your mission is, and I'm going to say simple here, we can discuss that in a moment. So the mission is to fix the broken food chain by converting waste into high-value insect products. So Before we go into the detail of what it is that you do, why is it so much of a problem?
Well, I suppose, food waste is a very large problem, both in terms of economic loss globally. I think it's over like $1 trillion of wasted value if you combine it. It's a massive environmental problem, which is probably the biggest kind of impact. There's around 4 gigatons of CO2 emissions associated with food wastage around the world. I mean, whenever it's something in a gigaton, it's pretty significant, right? And also, I think there's this inherent aspect, if you ask most people, obviously we live in times when it's quite polarized how people think and, who we support and whatnot. But food waste is a pretty universally kind of aligned topic when you explain it to people. No one really likes food waste. Everyone wants to get rid of it. So, inherently, we're talking about a challenge that needs to be solved because it's a problem for the planet. It's a problem economically. It's a problem, morally, if we can put it that way. So that's what got us into it. In the UK in particular, right, if we look at the numbers, it's around 13 million tons of food waste per year. So that's just like a huge quantity of this biomass that's sitting around, that's emitting greenhouse gases in landfill that, at best we use to produce energy at the moment for anaerobic digestion. So when you bring insects into the game, it's a much better proposition, I would say. They can do this faster, they can do it more sustainably. And, the nutrients that everyone worked so hard to grow in that food in the first place, we can keep as nutrients. In fact, we can even upgrade them to protein, to fat. So stuff that is really valuable to go back into the food supply chain, be it through animal feed and, hopefully one day through human food as well. But we're far away from that. So
that's really interesting. So I believe it's not the star of the show. You're the star of the show. But the star of the show is the black soldier fly larvae. Is that correct? The larvae that is consuming the food waste and it grows to provide nutrition-rich insect products. So I'm obviously no expert on insects and bugs. So what's so special about the black soldier fly?
Look, there's a few species that people have started kind of farming at this larger scale over the past decade. First, it might be worth saying that, the insect farming industry is very young. So we started this in 2015. We've been going now for, 8 years, I like to say, but it's going on to 9. And this entire industry is around 10 years old. So it's a very new kind of phenomenon, particularly in the West. Obviously, in Asia and Africa, there's been some, traditional usage of insects as food and whatnot. But here it's a pretty new thing. Now, the black soldier fly in particular has sort of emerged as the academics like to call it the crown jewel of the insect farming industry. And it's probably due to a variety of reasons. So for starters, it has a very quick life cycle. We're talking 14 days and less is the amount of time it would take for them to kind of consume this food waste and convert it into protein and fat. And, they will consume 4 or 5-fold of the final biomass in terms of waste. So, if you're going to get like 3 kilos of, let's say, larvae out, you could use up to, 15, 20 kilos of food waste. So it's a really powerful thing that can achieve this bioconversion quite quickly. Secondly, it's, as far as insects go, not too difficult to farm. It's got a complex life cycle, but once you get the gist of it, it's a very resilient species. So there's not many diseases, there's not any viruses known that sort of attack it. So you have to think, right? These are, for lack of a better word, maggots. So they have evolved for millions of years in environments that, were not the most glamorous environments. They're very resistant to microbes and these kinds of things. You want that in a species that you're going to farm, right, for something in this terms of use. And I guess the final reason is also, they produce some really good quality products out of them. So these larvae are going to be kind of 1-to-1 fat to protein by the time you harvest them. The fats, are chock full of lauric acid. Now, it could get quite technical, but if you use coconut oil is extremely rich in lauric acid as well. Right. It's got these anti-inflammatory properties. So it's a real good functional fat. And the protein is excellent quality, right? It's got all the essential amino acids. So it's like an animal grade protein. It's quite easily digestible. So it's a really useful kind of source of protein. Because obviously we have other sources of protein, but some of them might be more, difficult to digest. Some of them might not be that available. So insect farming is something that is promising to be truly universal and around the world. Different ways to do it in some countries than others. But overall, I think, it's showing real promise. So the black soldier fly is emerging as, I guess, top dog in this industry.
So as a new market with insect farming then, what has existed beforehand? This is obviously trying to disrupt an industry that already exists. What are people doing now?
So, look, most of the protein that we sort of use at the start of the food chain, right, is coming from soya at the moment. So we farm soya, at a global scale, despite the fact that it actually really happens in only a few select countries at the scale that supports global ambition on it. So we're talking, USA, Argentina, Brazil, they produce the vast majority of global soya. But this is 350 million tons of soya are produced each year. I mean, it's a humongous, amount. So that's the thing that powers all our animal farming, Yes, there's going to be some exceptions with small scale farming that, grazing, let's say, of cows and whatnot. But the vast majority of the chicken you buy, of, the pork products you buy, is going to be fed with some form of soya and grain. And the problem, soya is a great plant. I think that's very important to put out there because, there's this kind of passion of anger against soya. I know it's like the evil and whatnot, but it actually isn't. The problem is how we farm soya, right? So because it grows in these select countries, a lot of these countries will be, Amazon rainforest. Let's look at Brazil and, the kind of Cerrado region and whatnot. All of these areas store a lot of carbon, in terms of the trees they have on, the soil, the whatnot. So when we deforest these things to make more space for soya plantation, it really is super, super damaging for global emissions. And because, the way the world works, it's like, well, people eat meat, and, there's a lot of countries in the world that have been getting more affluent over the years. So their meat consumption has been going up. And as a result, they want more soya. They want more of this feed. So supply and demand, right? There's a demand for more soya. You cut down more forest. And it's a real problem from that front. A lot of people will know this as deforestation. And that's really this big problematic aspect for it. So insects can come in and start addressing some of these protein needs. They're by no means going to replace soya, right? Sometimes this is thrown around and like, oh yeah, we're going to replace soya with insects. The volume of soya is so large, you can't really replace it. Humanity has, rolled the dice on that one and we're sort of stuck a little bit with it. But we can get more sustainable on soya. And more importantly, we can use alternative proteins like insects to kind of fill this growth demand gap, right? Instead of cutting down more forest, let's use these alternatives to kind of feed it in. There's also aspects of fish meal, so we don't talk just about soya. Nowadays, if you want to eat fish that's been farmed, oftentimes it will require fish in their feed through the form of fish meal. So you're basically, catching fish to farm fish, and super, super bad for the marine ecosystem. Obviously, a lot of loss of biodiversity in these things. So if we could replace that with something that, hey, has been grown on another problem, food waste, I think it's just amazing that we can achieve this with technology nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good segue, I guess, to start talking about the actual product itself. So I believe the product's X1, is that right?
That's it. Yeah, that's how it started. So the first product we've built is Better OriginX X1. So it's going to be this, imagine a shipping container, and now imagine it's kind of full of larvae. That's the gist of it. Very early on, we realized, look, in the UK in particular, but many Western countries, automation is going to be absolutely key to make this viable. Even on a normal farm in the UK now, labor is so short. Everyone's trying to find ways how you can avoid it. It's hard to recruit for. Obviously, the working conditions might not be everyone's cup of tea. So it can be challenging, and that's why you need automation here. Now, let's say in Southeast Asia, you can do it very differently. You can employ just a lot of people and don't worry about that many machines. But the idea behind the X1 was, okay, let's build something that's automated where essentially you can put food waste on one end and get your larvae out on the other one.
Yeah.
So we've launched that in 2020, and since then it's gone through several generations of evolution. We've created an X2 and an XL. We're following the X kind of nomenclature. And, these are slightly larger systems that can suit farms that are larger. I guess the original use, of these X1s has been poultry farming. So we place these things on farms, we source kind of waste, we put it through the system, and then the larvae that are grown, the farmer can harvest every day and, supplement feed to their flock. So we've mainly done this in laying hens. And what this means is that, 60-70% of the emissions when you buy an egg come from feed, because soya is the big driver for it. So even if you can replace a little amount of that, especially if you can use waste that would otherwise go to landfill or AD, then there's actually a really good carbon balance, and imbalance in terms that it reduces it overall. So that egg is more sustainable as a result. So that's how the X1, sort of started. But another thing that maybe wasn't the idea when we commenced with the X1 was it really allowed us to develop our technology in a contained, let's say, small environment. And I say small, shipping container isn't exactly small, but compared to a giant warehouse doing, 100,000 tons of waste per year, it is small. And that's really allowed us to do iterations over the past 4 years, progressing the technology, getting better and better and better, at a much lower cost than some of our global competitors. So that really put Better Origin now in quite a good position as far as, the understanding goes, as far as, the technology readiness goes for scale up.
So can I just ask you to describe it? I've been in one. I know there can be a little whiffy, for sure.
It is the
one
food
of the
waste.
Exactly. But can you talk someone through? You've got this big shipping container, which is really beautiful. It's properly engineered, designed. It looks really great from the outside as well. But just walk people through what actually happened, please.
Yeah, no, of course. So, imagine a shipping container that's essentially been insulated from the inside. That's because insects, black soldier fly larvae, will be grown in a warmer environment. So there's quite an important part of climate control in it. We need to always control the temperature, the humidity levels, and so on. So there's this big kind of insulated grow room that's got a moving floor. And when I say moving floor, it's, this system that moves around stacks of trays. So, when you get a delivery from Sainsbury's or whatnot, it will come in these big kind of crates. Yeah. So imagine lots of those crates stacked up. Each one of those is the growth environment for our larvae. So, we would put baby larvae in at the beginning, and then you kind of dose it with food, either in one big lump at the beginning or every day, kind of little by little. And this system of ours really allows that flexibility. So how you want to kind of feed these larvae. And then these larvae spend, something between 7 to 14 days inside, depending on what you feed them, depending on what you want to do with them after they have been harvested. And, throughout this entire period, there's a cycle, how you change the temperature, how you change the humidity, and so on. What's more in these systems, we've really invested a lot into not just automation for automation's sake, but data. So this entire device, the X1, can be controlled remotely. So we can, I could log into it now from my phone and activate a pump or, shut it down or try to see what's gone wrong with a certain tray. And early on, that sort of seemed like, do we really want to do this? Because this is an industry where you have to solve 1,000 things at once, simultaneously. So it's inherently quite complex and challenging. But as it's gone through the various iteration, now I would say, our data capture and the automation is one of the most powerful things that has come out of the X1. So giant kind of refrigerator-like box, controlled temperature, chock full of maggots.
So in your example, this is like on a farm. So the farmer or, the owner of the space where this thing's sitting, you have to run power to it, you have to run water to it. Is there any kind of day-to-day maintenance interaction that the farmer has to do with it? Or does it run in a self-contained manner? How does that kind of work?
That was actually a very important sort of design consideration for us when we set up the first X1 and, the ones that followed. We knew this was going to be on a farm, as a target destination. And farmers are like some of the world's busiest people. You know, they always have things to do. They never have weekends. They barely take any holiday. So asking a farmer to do a lot every day is, I mean, you can try, but you should know they're probably not going to do it. So we really wanted to minimize the interaction the farmer had to have with one of the X1s. And we minimized it to basically, you go in, the system pulls aside the trays that are ready to be harvested, where the larvae are fully grown and ready for, further processing. And effectively, they pick that out, put the empty trays back in, and that's it. As far as the interaction with the system goes, everything else is, largely done remotely by us. Regular maintenance, fixing any breakdowns and whatnot. Certainly changed over time as well. More breakdowns at the beginning than now these devices are running pretty well. But it's a journey, right? So there's always a journey involved with that. So, it's a balance between automation for automation's sake and, asking the user to do the bare minimum. So for us, harvesting kind of made sense. You could automate that, but, it might add another 20, 30,000 pounds of cost. Yeah. And you're like, okay, how many years spending 15 minutes a day would you need to do what an average farmer's, or farmhand wage to justify that investment? And it just, it doesn't really make sense to automate everything. So we've tried to be very pragmatic about it.
So we've spoken to some people in similar fields, adjacent kind of fields, not fields in a farming sense. In a farm setting, is it kind of crop spoilage that's going as the food waste? So at the growing stage rather than, further up the value chain in terms of like a restaurant setting or a supermarket setting. Do you envisage it kind of sitting at all stages of that process? Could you take spoilage from a supermarket or a restaurant and put that kind of waste into the product as well? Or is it more a crop stage that it works more effectively?
Well, one day I would hope it would be all of those stages. But there is, a complex landscape of regulation and incentive/disincentive through policy that's currently lacking to allow it to be at all the stages. So when we talk about these containers being on farms, the primary input for this was manufacturing supply chain waste. So this is going to be, the various kind of packing warehouses or that make kind of an end product, but are going to have some wastage in the process. You can only legally use, fruit, vegetable, kind of grain waste. You can't use anything that's meat. In this, and that's because of the current, policy framework, both in the UK, Europe, some other countries, although not the rest of the world, but here we are having to play by those rules. So when you look at these, X1s, probably the most kind of famous example for us is our partnership with Morrison's, one of the largest supermarkets. And what we did in this situation is, we placed the X1s and X2s around their poultry farms. Morrison's being a very unique supermarket in that it is vertically integrated, so they will own, quite a large part of their supply chain. So it really allowed them to kind of pull things together and make this work. So we took waste from their manufacturing sites, essentially processed that into, imagine like a sort of porridge of sorts, and then you feed that into the X1s and X2s, and you get larvae out on the other end. The larvae went directly to feed laying hens, and, Morrison's on the back of this launched planet-friendly egg, a much lower carbon footprint egg. And insects play an important role in that. It was by no means the only thing they could do for that, but it certainly helped a lot. One day, look, I hope we could use things like hospitality waste or, all the supermarket waste that comes out. But at the moment, this is actually one of the biggest challenges behind supporting our sector in the UK. And, I know our European kind of brothers and sisters in this industry are facing similar challenges.
And from a business model perspective, in that farm setting, maybe an independent farmer versus one that's owned by a supermarket, but, what does it cost to place the equipment, run the equipment, and then, are they gaining a commercial benefit from not having to buy, commercially available feed for those animals because they can replace it with the byproduct of the X1? Or how does that kind of business model work?
A really important part of it. So when we started placing our X1s and X2s on farms, the cost of producing larvae is still quite high. Yes, it is remotely operated. Yes, it is automated, but the capex for the equipment quite high. Still, you have a lot of interventions. You need to supply baby larvae regularly to the system every week, be it thrown delivery or third-party logistics. As you can imagine, third-party logistics for baby maggots, quite challenging.
Quite niche.
Quite niche, quite challenging. So, the cost, if you had to just replace like per like, let's say some soy in that feed, soy is, dirt cheap. It's going to be less than 400 pounds a ton. It wouldn't have worked economically. So how we made it work was actually by, what's the value of supplying this to a flock of laying hens? Because what we've seen over years of research through academics, partnerships, through, farms, is that you get real improvements, both in the performance of the birds. So, they lay more eggs, they lay bigger eggs, they eat less feed, whilst also supporting health. So we found, we had a situation where on one of the farms, which is quite common, right, in the farming industry, there was a disease that broke out, and you had these 2 sheds, same amount of chickens in each one, from the same lot, same kind of parent flocks and whatnot. And one that was insect fed, fared much, much better when the disease struck. So the mortality was much lower, they recovered faster. So you get these things because you're really feeding a supernatural feed to the birds, right? Birds didn't evolve to eat soy and crushed up grain. A lot of birds, especially baby birds, the first thing they're going to eat is insects because it's such a good source of nutrients for them. So we boosted health, and there's also welfare, and welfare is kind of one of these changing aspects, right? We all care about welfare, but are we willing to pay for more welfare? That's always kind of a trade-off in the industry. But really what we found is when you feed these insects to the birds, it's literally their happiest time of the day. And you can literally hear it from the birds, the decibels, they're all like, wah, wah, wah. So you can I remember there's quite a few farms where the farmer drove the trays that they've harvested, and when the birds saw the kind of quad bike with a little trailer, immediately, they started kind of vocalizing, and all of them then rush out to, meet the farmer. So they're really happy about it, right? They're going to scoff them down in a couple of seconds because it's, imagine it's like candy to them. But then they spend the next 4 or 5 hours still looking if they've missed one or two, and that keeps the birds entertained in a way, and it keeps them away from pecking at each other and causing injury, from pulling each other's feathers, which then can cause, performance losses, but also disease to spread out more easily and generally, stress out the birds. So unstressing the birds is really useful, particularly in this world where avian influenza comes every year. It stays for most of the year. The birds have to be locked in. So it can be a really helpful way to kind of address everything there, right? Performance, health, and welfare. And that's how we created that value proposition that allowed us to charge, more than you would on a per protein basis, whilst delivering benefits for the end user. It's also worth highlighting that, the changes needed here, let's say if we replace some of the soya with insects, the changes needed at the consumer end is less than a pence an egg, right? And we've all seen the price of eggs double over the past 12, 18 months. And now it's the new normal, So I think part of it is also how do we incentivize these big supply chains to, change for those transitions? Because, the doubling of eggs has shown, hey, the consumer is going to pay for it. You know what I mean? And we do live in a cost of living crisis and so on. So you can't just rely on that. But most of these interventions that would allow industries like ours to kind of grow at the beginning and be really supported are pretty minimal. We're not going to be the ones that go from, hey, it's £2 a pack of eggs to £6. It's £2 to £2.10. And I appreciate there's going to be consumers where that is a problem. But for the vast majority of us here in this room, would you really notice those 10p extra? And little things like that can actually have a huge impact on how we address sustainability in food production.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point, isn't it, as well? You've got to look at the bigger picture on some of these things. If you're constantly, I think most people will be horrified when they see battery farmed hens and obviously other areas as well. But I mean, I've been there, haven't I? We did the BBC Click, and I've been in the poultry farm, which was just, a really high welfare level poultry farm. But it was amazing. So those things, and I'm not going to do a chicken sound, just everyone be ready for that. I'm not going to do that. Just you. I'll leave that entirely up to you, Miha. But what you said was absolutely true. They were happy hens. And so if you can communicate that to the consumers, then obviously they're not going to mind. They understand why there's that extra cost to it as well.
I was just going to jump in there. What's been the reaction then from the farming community and Morrison's? How long has that relationship been developing? Are they really endorsing what you're doing? How has the industry reacted to it?
Yeah, no, it's been extremely supportive, I would say, from everyone involved since the first X1 to now. Morrison's has really made a commitment to more sustainable production. As a vertically integrated supermarket, they can do more than some others, particularly in the current lack of actually any policy to incentivize long-term changes, right? Because you have to think at the moment, as far as legislation goes, there's nothing there. We said, we're going to be net zero by 2050, but there's no actuals in it, right? We're just kind of blabbing about it. So it's important for corporates like Morrison's to say, do you know what, we're going to do something about it and set these goals. And hopefully over time, they're going to be even more supported by the right policy in place. But yeah, the reception has been really good, especially in the first few years. A real big challenge for us has been, after the invasion of Ukraine, I think we'll remember kind of the prices of eggs going up. It was like a triple whammy for that industry. So the price of feed sort of shot through the roof. And where I said earlier, 60-70% of the carbon footprint of producing an egg is the feed. The cost is quite similar. More than 50% is the cost of feed. This is why we're having double the price eggs. But for the first 6 months, a lot of retailers would have said, oh, do you know what, we have a contract. Because the UK is quite typical for these long-term contracts with farmers. So you had situations where farmers were having to pay more to kind of keep the birds alive than they would get back from the eggs. And that's really meant that the industry over the past 18 months has gone through quite a flux. There was a lot more farms. A lot of people kind of shut down those farms. There was also avian influenza in parallel, so there's extra stresses. If a poultry farmer gets avian flu, they effectively have to cull all the birds and do it quickly. And they get some recompensation from the government, but it's quite little compared to the investment they're going to have in it. So there was this kind of massive squeeze on their economics. And what that means is innovation, like what we do, that gets put on the back burner.
Superficially, you would think, food security is becoming a well-discussed topic and, reliance on fragile imports of grain and things like that, you would have thought would play to your favour. But it's interesting that you add the complexity of long-term contracts, which actually limit how flexible, the food industry can be to adapt to that change. I mean, that's kind of, it's a frustrating situation to be in, but surely this solution really would help with food security as well.
Yeah, and I think, look, over the next decade, as the price of it drops, I think it will become more competitive. In parallel, we're seeing, probably soya rise and more policy coming in. So there will be some kind of meeting point at some stage where, a small intervention through insects or things like that would just be a no-brainer. At the moment, the reality is there's a lot of lip service on sustainability. We all like to talk about it, government level, corporates, small businesses, everyone's talking a lot about it. But when you look at the reality of things, cash is king still. Right. So, and especially over the past few years, as there's been a cost of living crisis, it's even more king. So a lot of people say one thing, but do another. And the way you change that is by having clear policy on it. And I agree, food security is important. And you don't really appreciate food security until you run out of food, by which point it's a little bit too late. But, to make sure that we put the money where the mouth is, so to speak, we need to be a lot more holistic how these things are addressed. Because, look, the reality is if sustainability was the cheapest thing you can possibly do, everything would already be sustainable. We wouldn't be having these conversations. But, kind of cost-neutral sustainability is still quite difficult to achieve in the industry, especially if you can avoid the greenwashing aspect of it. And I think, it is dire time that as a community, we start making some changes here. And look, talking about it, I think is the first kind of stage. But I really want to start seeing some changes that set a very clear framework, right? I'm not saying like ban things overnight, like that wouldn't work, right? We don't want to upset the food supply chain. We all rely on it quite fundamentally. But, let's set out some milestones for the next 5, 10, 15 years, because that gives everyone an idea how you have to invest into these solutions by 2030, 2035. And eventually we will end up in a world where sustainability makes the most sense.
And innovation definitely has a role to play there. So I think what you've done with X1, X2 is, on location, that's starting to make some of the change and getting people to think differently.
If you are a startup looking to grow in Cambridge, the Bradfield Centre offers a range of flexible membership packages which put you in control of your office and home working mix. There's a vibrant, collaborative atmosphere, on-site cafe, plenty of green outside space, and regular member social events. We also offer a range of high-quality meeting spaces for hire, and for tech event organisers, our auditorium, lakeside pavilion, and atrium spaces are perfect to bring your communities together for in-person and hybrid events. For more information, visit bradfieldcentre.com or call 01223 919 600.
The other thing I'm really interested in is the OriginX, which is where the whole concept of the scaling and the processing line. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I sort of started hinting to it a little bit earlier, right? So the X1s and the future generations of this modular approach allowed us to develop a tech. So now we're very confident, how our systems work, how we can adjust it to different inputs to make it work every single time. But the reality is food waste, right? I said earlier, UK, 13 million tons, 1.3 billion tons globally. I mean, it's a huge problem. One of our X1s, X2s, it will do, a couple hundred tons a year. So it's like not even a drop in the ocean. And a lot of, let's say, supermarkets or very large, food multinationals, the amount of waste they're going to deal with is just so large that an X1 or X2, even 10 of them, is just not even going to touch the sites, right? So from that perspective, the OriginX is really to address those problems, to address, the opportunities where there's 5,000 tons of waste available per year and above. And, the modular nature allows us to really suit that to a customer. So if someone has 8,000 and another one has 14,000, our approach, this kind of modular room, if you think about it, we can plonk X1-like growing rooms on the side of the building, and all of a sudden you have, a more centralized site. Still not mega factories, right? But something that's suitable for the amount of waste that is available in a certain region or a certain factory or whatnot. So that's the idea behind why, we started with an X1, X2, and why we're talking about the OriginX, or this factory of the future. On farms, what we would do is obviously you harvest the larvae and then you still feed them directly unprocessed. The most natural thing you could do for birds, they absolutely love it. But when you talk about these centralized sites, transporting larvae over even medium distances is quite difficult. This creature, if it gets warm, unfortunately, it starts moving more, which makes it go warmer and warmer. So, we've seen both in lab situations and above, they will literally cook themselves. So you can't transport this thing very easily. You really need to kind of solve it on site. So what we do in this OriginX is we would process them and create, from cooked larvae to wonderful puree/pate to various kind of flours out of them. We can extract the oil out. So we basically would treat it, let's say you have soya processing facilities, they do very similar things, right? It's grown in Brazil, they're going to take it to a plant, they're going to extract the oil out, they're going to kind of crush it, and then you create like different kinds of products from it. So this is what we would do with the larvae that we would farm on these sites. And specifically when it comes to processing, what's quite unique to us at Better Origin is we've developed this processing technology from scratch. So I'm quite an avid cook in my free time, and I've tried to apply that know-how to, insects over the past 8 years. And as a result, we've developed, an industrial scale processing line that really allows us to create some superior quality products out of it. And whereas, that quality might not matter that much if you sell it to poultry feed, it matters so much if you're ever thinking about human food or in the currently active market of pet food. So yeah, that's the concept.
So the new product's not just about scaling the conversion process, it's actually about the end product moving into the human food chain or the pet food chain. It's both those things together.
Exactly. And, human food chain, not so much at the moment.
Although you did make me eat bugs on that trip. Do you remember?
I did.
Yes,
That was one of the first experiments we did with deep fried larvae with turmeric and whatnot.
Yeah.
I mean, they're delicious. They might not look the most appetizing.
You
but
just got to think Bombay mix and you're all right.
Yeah, it's especially when you kind of pull them out where you kind of cook them, it really smells like roasted nuts. And when you think about it, it's protein, it's fat, so it's composition-wise very similar. Yeah. Doesn't look like roasted nuts, but, nutritionally and kind of organoleptically, so when you're going to taste it or smell it, it is very similar.
I mean, it does feel like there's been a number of waves of trying to bring insects into everyone's day-to-day diet. I don't think we've quite got there yet.
No.
So I think it's really smart that the pitch and the proposition is around the ecological benefit, the animal feed method. That in itself creates, it sounds like a sustainable business.
Exactly.
The human leap then is just
one day.
Yeah, it's a longer term goal, and you're not having the burden of trying to re-educate the entire human food chain, because that's a challenge, right?
Well, massive challenge, right? So there's some really interesting businesses in the UK now doing that on the human front. So there's a business called Yumbug in London. They've opened a restaurant a month ago. They primarily work with crickets, shrimp of the land. So it's a little bit more acceptable. Yeah, well, selling larvae is a little bit more difficult than shrimp of the land. But I would thoroughly recommend to go there. I think Finsbury Park Station is where they are. But it's delicious. They've shown actually this is not like, we're going to have you eat Soylent Green-like things. They make croquettes, they make tacos, they make a chili. It's delicious. It's surprising because, my co-founder, Fotis, he's maybe not as easily convinced on shoving insects into his mouth than me. I did it for science purposes, let's say. But he was super impressed with that as well. So anyone who wants to try it, I would thoroughly recommend Yumbug. But I agree with you. We're not there yet. It's going to take a long time, and even the Yumbug guys, for them, this restaurant is an education mission, right? Yeah. How do we get people to know this before it can become more widely available? But actually, this is why pet food is so big, right? And this is the primary market for pretty much all of insect industry at the moment, because pets, livestock is all about cost. Least cost formulations for feed, same when it goes to welfare, same when it goes to everything, right? So you kind of want to make sure you produce a product that the consumer is going to buy, and price, let's face it, is the most important thing. So when you talk about pet food, it's slightly different though. There's been a lot of trends over the past decade when we sort of humanize pets. They're parts of the family. They're not just, a dog outside watching against, wolves for sheep, like traditional uses, right? Most of us have pets as part of family. Especially in the UK, I would argue a lot of people spend more on their pet than maybe on their spouse, right? So it's quite interesting because it's almost like you are selling it to a human or a member of the family. And therefore, adding premium to it is a lot more acceptable. You can go and buy dog food now in a discounter and you're going to pay £3 for 5 kilos. Or you can go in a premium store and pay £50 for 5 kilos. So there's a real kind of range, and people, like to buy depending on their spending habits or how they feel they want to treat their pet. So it's a market that's a lot more open to a more premium product. And, at the same time, it's nutritionally great for dogs, right? It's got all the nutrients they need. There's now evidence emerging of all the benefits of the, black soldier fly fat on their gut health, on the coat, particularly sensitive dogs, which is always such a struggle when you need to buy these extremely expensive diets. They really do well on insects because being a novel protein, most dogs will have been eating chicken all their life, right? So they can develop allergies towards it. So with insects, you can kind of avoid that in a more cost-friendly way, despite this being a premium product. Pet food has really become kind of a gateway, let's put it in a way, to get insects eventually also more on human plates.
This is really fascinating. You've got some great backers. You've got Boulderton Capital, right? So very big name there. What's been the reaction from the investor community?
Towards insects?
Yeah, and towards the kind of the proposition in general.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one, right? So if we look at the beginning of this industry, so let's take 5-6 years back, the golden times of venture capital, when no ticket was too large and no opportunity too small to miss out. Obviously, that's now changed, and I'm sure you've had lots of people on this podcast telling similar things, so I shan't go too deeply into that. But especially in our industry, the first decade, I will say, there's been little focus on the capital intensity of this business. It's been largely seen through the eyes of, everyone's going to build a technology platform. It's going to be like a software business, hockey stick growth. But the reality is, it's not going to be quite like that, right? There's going to be opportunities for technology, and those are going to give you hockey stick revenues. But the nature and the fact is, we need to build infrastructure for this, which makes it inherently, I will say, more challenging for the vast majority of especially early stage and, growth investors. Now, having said that, there's a lot of investors these days that really are investing, on tickets of sustainability, on, deep tech, which is how we would define ourselves. Problems that are going to take maybe 1 decade or 2 to solve before it's really like a boom. And, with Boulderton, who have been an amazing partner to us, they viewed a lot of opportunities in our sector and really appreciated our modular and tech-focused approach to it. And yeah, they've been great, the entire journey. I'm really glad we got them on board because they've really allowed us to grow and develop and, weather the past few years. I'm sure you get a lot of stories, especially here in Cambridge being so, vibrant in startup world. It's been a tough market the past few years to raise funding, right? Unless you were doing amazing unit economics. But that's also allowed businesses like ours and others in our sector to shift away from growth for the sake of growth towards, okay, how do we actually solve the unit economics at a small scale before we scale up? And there again, our modular approach and doing it smaller scale first has helped. Had we started building a big factory 3-4 years ago, I'm not sure I would be here, or maybe I would be here with a different idea. You know what I mean? So there's been a bit of a luck involved in that situation. But I think, look, at the end of the day, investing in these kind of solutions into food security, into deep tech is going to be important. Even more, I would say, in a volatile world that we live in today, because food security, we don't care about it until there's food on supermarket shelves. But we've experienced it over the past few years that, salad was gone and there was still other stuff we could eat. But there could be futures ahead of us where, some of those things are not so accessible. And in those cases, these kinds of technology would be very valuable assets. So I think there might be more strategic investment in the future. And it really highlights, whose role it is to support just and sustainable transition. And, the private sector, obviously in private capital, has done a lot of that in the past couple of decades. But I think we are now approaching that point where actually we have to start seeing some action from governments, and not just domestic, but, internationally coordinated policy, which is a really big ask in the world we live today, right? But that's the only way we're really going to allow these things to grow and to have this capacity should, a bad period come. So, yeah.
So fundraising's one element of being a startup, but what's the rest of the journey been like? So when we were walking in here, you're the CSO, and it's like we're having a conversation about actually you have to do absolutely everything. So there's yourself and Fotis Fotiadis as the other co-founder. What have been the highs and lows? How's the team developed? Just give us a little bit of a flavour of the journey for the last 8-9 years. Yeah,
it's an interesting one for sure. The fact is, we've been doing, as I said earlier, 8, almost 9 years now. So there's been a lot of highs and lows, right? To give you a flavor of it, we started as 4 founders. There's 2 of us now. So we went through a very common thing in most startups, I would say, twice. There's periods where there's a lot of investment in things like sustainability. So 2020, 2021, there was a lot of that. Then you have periods, as we just discussed, right, that it's going a little bit down. So you have to live through these peaks and troughs, so we can call it that way. Overall, I think living through all of this, working through all of this has made us stronger. has made us a more resilient business. It has allowed us and our employees to grow a lot because you have to do a lot of different things. And, particularly I would say over the past year, like many other businesses, we had to go for a downsizing. It's hard to find a business that didn't do it.
Yeah.
And it's extremely difficult, right? Especially for, I would say, founders who you see the inevitable, and then for a period of time before the act actually happens of making redundancies, it's just you. And maybe you're lucky if you have a co-founder, so you can talk to someone about it. But, looking at it back now, it was extremely difficult, like mental health period, right? Because you kind of understand what you have to go through. But those things, had to be done. The poultry market, as I said to you, was kind of done a downturn. So we had to kind of pivot and shift. And you'd think, this many years in, you don't do that many of those, but we've done it so much through the period, being a new industry, a new sector, a new value proposition, and how you fit into things. It's not an app that makes financial transactions faster.
Yeah.
It's like a completely new ecosystem. So yeah, we've had to be flexible. We've had to be resilient. But I think we've all emerged as stronger as a result of it and more ready to sort of tackle the future on it. I mean, to give you a specific, right, there was about 45 of us last year around this time. And after the downsizing now, we've got a team of 25. But funnily enough, we're more productive as 25 than we were as 45. Like, it's ridiculous. We're doing more things now than we did beforehand.
I mean, my observation was going to be, as you say, a straight pure play software business is understood by everyone. With you guys, it's so multidisciplinary, isn't it? You've got the science, you've got the industrial design, you've got the hardware, the software. You need to understand the food chain and the value that the industry around that. You need to be able to evangelize and tell the story about something that's quite challenging as well. I mean, that's a lot of skill sets in a fairly small number of people.
Generalists. This is why we really benefit from generalists in our sector. And the people that do really well at Better Origin, and I would imagine in a lot of businesses like ours across the world, are the people who, yes, I might have a degree in XYZ and this is my specialty, but I don't mind helping out with this marketing event. Or, yeah, I'm happy to, consider what the regulation or licensing might be needed if we want to build a farm in this particular location. Those kind of skill sets are super valuable in deep techs, especially when there's hardware related and it's not just a software thing. So that has, I think, really helped. And as I said earlier, walking here in with you, right, I become a generalist. Like, I used to be, a scientist. I was going to do like a cancer research and all that stuff. And now I'm like so far away from that. But I know why I had to do it. And I'm actually very glad I did, because looking back at it now, I realize how much stronger of an individual, but also as a team, you become by being able to do that. It also means that, the profile of staff we've had over the years has changed. The first 4 years, I would say, of Better Origin were pretty much R&D. We were in labs, we were figuring out the basics. So the profile of staff we needed then is very different from now when we do, operations, logistics, a lot more sales, a lot more marketing. And there's still very important R&D elements, but it kind of like changes the allocation over time.
Yeah.
Whereas, I'm sure it's similar with even a pure software play. You tend to go from more kind of building to like more selling. But I think it's quite pronounced in an industry like this where you literally touch, every possible skill set. So, yeah, I like to say it's a very broad church, insect farming. And, we have a use pretty much of every skill set from, unskilled kind of manual labor, from my lips to God's ears. Please bring more people like that into the UK at the moment, because it's been so difficult over the past few years, especially in Cambridge with a high cost of living, to, AI experts at the very forefront that help us make things more efficient over time, to literally everything in between. But it also means that everyone who's keen to engage, who's keen to go the extra mile, you have so many learning opportunities literally on your job every day. Like, if you're a little bit interested in this, you're going to have some fantastic people that allow you to learn about it. And, you're not going to have the same opportunity in a lot of other businesses, right? If we're kind of a lab-based producing a reagent, everyone's going to be quite similar. I mean, I'm not saying personality-wise, but, skill set. Everyone's going to be molecular biologist, biochemist, or, cell scientists. In our kind of business, it's really is a lot of diversity as far as that goes.
Yeah, it's a great lesson. Adaptability, flexibility, all those kinds of things, isn't it? So thank you, Miha. It's been really interesting. It's been great to have you on the show. And good luck with the changing policy and getting insect farming onto the main agenda.
Thank you very much. And we're going to need it, I think. But yeah, we're keen to make a change. We're keen to improve sustainability and food security in our supply chains, and watch this space, right?
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Today's show was produced by Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner, Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It will really help others discover the show.
The Cambridge Tech Podcast is supported by Rathbones, a leading provider of individual wealth management services to private clients, entrepreneurs, charities and professional partners. For more information, please visit rathbones.com. The value of your investments and the income from them may go down as well as up, and you could get back less than you invested.
Cambridge Science Centre provides children and young people with positive community-based STEM experiences to raise aspirations and illuminate STEM careers. We're supported by a collaborative ecosystem of organisations and individuals, and we'd love you to join us. Find out more by contacting me at rebeccaporter@cambridgesciencecentre.org.